Hey everyone, welcome back to Legal Nightmares Are Us with your host, Diana Davison. Now, I've been talking about a number of trials. First of all, the trial of Jian Ghomeshi. The decision in that case will be issued this coming week on March 24th. Go watch my videos on it if you haven't yet. If you're in the Toronto area on March 24th, feminists have already organized a protest under the concept of #BelieveHer and will be marching the streets regardless of the decision. Most people expect Ghomeshi to be acquitted, and they expect that for very good reason. All three accusers were shown to have lied under oath. You might want to show your support for due process and make your own sign for that event. I've also talked about the trial of Gregory Allen Elliott, who faced charges of criminal harassment, and I've shown that his accuser, Stephanie Guthrie, was knowingly harassing Mr. Elliott the whole time, and in a lecture she gave at Fanshawe College, describes her own activities as internet violence. She even uses the word terrorism. There is some public interest in that case in demanding Toronto police investigate a currently unknown person who created an impersonation account of Mr. Elliott as part of their harassment against him. This account was on Twitter, and the investigation might uncover a lot more of the truth behind the injustices enacted upon Mr. Elliott. Today, I'm going to talk about a verdict in a trial called Robinson versus Furlong. It was a defamation case and quite stunning for a few reasons. First of all, Laura Robinson is a freelance journalist who published a story accusing John Furlong, a decorated public figure, of abusing children about 40 years ago when he taught at a BC school, which had many Aboriginal students. That was a part of the accusations, racism and physical abuse towards the First Nations people. Police opened an investigation, which was closed without charges. I'll get into why. 3 students sued Mr. Furlong in civil court, but the cases were dropped, and I'll get into why. Mr. Furlong sued Robinson and the Georgia Straight, who published her article, for defamation, but dropped those suits when the charges against him were dropped. Just wanted to be done with it all. And here we are today. Laura Robinson actually sued Mr. Furlong for defamation because in the course of events he called her a liar, among other accusations. So if you followed that, basically a journalist destroyed someone's life and then went on to sue him for defamation. If that seems outrageous, the good thing that came of this case, going through the trial, is that we now have legal facts to tell us what actually happened to set off this sordid series of events. What I hope to answer in this video is how a large number of people can make similar claims of abuse against an innocent person. I also want to expose journalists who irresponsibly destroy the lives of others just to get a scoop. I'll be using the facts as established in court during the Robinson versus Furlong case and put those next to the story that Laura Robinson told Jesse Brown on his podcast, Canadaland. Now, Jesse Brown was really disturbed about this case because, as a freelance journalist himself, he has made serious criminal accusations against a public person, that is Jian Ghomeshi, and expects to be covered by Toronto Star's liability insurance. Robinson was not covered as a freelancer and has been having to foot her own legal bills. Now, on to the case. In terms of journalistic ethics, Judge Wedge begins her decision with a quote from Story-Based Inquiry, a Manual for Investigative Journalists. Never forget that investigation is a weapon, and you can hurt people with it deliberately or by your own carelessness. Not enough is made of the fact that Woodward and Bernstein of Watergate fame, by their own admission, destroyed the careers of several innocent people along with Richard Nixon's. In the course of your career, that's journalists' careers, you're going to be the best and the worst thing that ever happens to some other people. Be careful about which role you play, and for whom, and why. In contrast to that ethic, I want to establish how Jesse Brown feels about fact-checking as a journalist. This is what Jesse had to say on a podcast with Patreon, discussing how he crowdfunded the show Canadaland.
all of the concerns that I think inhibit a certain kind of journalism, having to go through an editor, though there's huge advantages to that in terms of, copy editing and fact checking and stuff. But, as we grow, we're taking on more and more of that side of things. But the problems that come with an editor, the truth is that there's no better fact checker, no better copy editor than the public. Unfortunately, you have to publish first to get their input often.
So when Jesse Brown tells you a source is credible, just toss it out the window and demand the facts so that you can check them yourself. That's what he expects. That means no more anonymous sources anymore, Jesse. So here's what Jesse has to say about how Robinson's story about Furlong is similar to his story about Ghomeshi.
The story will sound familiar. A incredibly well-liked, well-respected, powerful, well-connected Canadian faces many credible allegations of physical abuse, assault, and sexual abuse.
I hope that when I'm done destroying the credibility of Robinson's story, you'll remember the similarities to Brown's story about Ghomeshi. Now, first of all, I'm going to capture the timeline, and it's a little bit out of order in the case, so I'm going to jump around a little bit, and this is for the purpose of showing you how this story even got to Laura Robinson's desk. From the decision. Mr. Furlong's evidence, which was not challenged, was that he visited Burns Lake many times after immigrating to Canada. One such visit occurred when Mr. Furlong was CEO of VANOC, that's the Olympic Committee, and he decided over the objections of VANOC colleagues that the Olympic torch relay must pass through Burns Lake, in part because of his prior connection to the community. Mr. Furlong went to Burns Lake with other VANOC representatives to announce that decision and make a public speech about the torch relay. This is backed up by evidence from Renee Smith-Valade, who was the vice president of communications of VANOC from 2005 to 2010. She was there when the speech was given, and she said the event occurred without incident. Several First Nations people helped to organize the event at which he spoke. Now, although nothing happened during the speaking event, Mr. Furlong testified at trial that he was approached in late 2009 by Gary Youngman, a First Nations lawyer working for VANOC and partner of Ms. Hogan. Mr. Youngman told Mr. Furlong that he had met with a young woman who alleged she had been strapped by Mr. Furlong. Mr. Furlong responded that if a former student said she'd had a bad experience with him, he'd like to meet with her. A meeting took place at the home of Mr. Youngman and Ms. Hogan. Mr. Furlong told the group he had never strapped anyone and that only the principal of the school could do that, and he'd never witnessed it happening. According to Mr. Furlong, he shook hands with the student, and the meeting ended. Mr. Furlong testified that at some point during the meeting, Mr. Youngman raised the issue of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He then said that for $5,000, the complaint of the former student could probably go away. After the meeting, Mr. Furlong called a police officer responsible for Olympic security and reported the threat and its context. The police officer told Mr. Furlong to report the incident to the Vancouver Police Department, which he did. Correspondence sent and received at that time confirms that Mr. Furlong reported the matter to the police. All right, so keep in mind the name Ms. Hogan, that's quite important. And this is Laura Robinson's description of her first information on this story.
And then one guy said to me, and I don't know who it was because he wouldn't give me his name.
Right.
He said, you want a real story. John Furlong came from Ireland and taught at a residential school.
All right, so Robinson is downtown Vancouver interviewing First Nations people, asking lots of questions about their involvement with the Olympics. And lo and behold, around the same time that Furlong was facing an attempted extortion, some mysterious person, we don't know, comes up to her and plants this story idea. So what happens next?
So anyway, nothing came up, and I dropped that story completely, and I covered the Olympics. I've covered every Summer Olympics since Atlanta in '96. This was my first Winter Olympics to cover, and almost forgot about it. And then Mr. Furlong's book came out called Patriot Hearts, and I was reviewing it for Anishinaabe News, which is a First Nations newspaper I've worked for many years. That story's out there for a year, and then in comes an email from another First Nations person.
All right, so she gets an email, and this is from the trial notes now. Ms. Robinson testified that in March 2012, she received an email from an individual who was previously unknown to her, He had read her article, Sins of Omission, and told her that she should look into Mr. Furlong's time at Immaculata School in Burns Lake, where he had allegedly physically abused 2 students. He gave Ms. Robinson the name of a friend of one of the 2 students. The friend was a woman named Deb Hogan. This is the same Hogan who was involved in the extortion attempt. Ms. Robinson said she contacted Ms. Hogan, who recounted to her a meeting that had occurred at Ms. Hogan's home between the student and Mr. Furlong shortly before the Winter Olympics. According to Ms. Hogan, in the course of the meeting, the student alleged that Mr. Furlong had beaten her, and she said Mr. Furlong denied any such contact. So, I don't know why, but for some reason, Laura Robinson, even if she didn't know about the extortion attempt, having found out that her source, her original source, was connected to an attempt to extort John Furlong, she has not made any attempt to investigate her sources further, any apologies over having been connected, any attempt that I know of to find out more about this police report on the extortion. You would think as a journalist that would be really important to her.
And then he gave me 2 examples that included violence. And that set me on a search. You know, I called up to the Burns Lake Band office, and within a minute and a half, someone had emailed me and said, I had Mr. Furlong, so did my siblings. What are you writing about? And I contacted the Indian Residential School Survivor Society. Those people put me on to a whole bunch of people. Like, they have a northern BC office. They have quite a few offices in northern BC. So, you know, from Ontario, I was able to do a number of telephone interviews.
Okay, now this is intriguing because in that segment, Laura Robinson tells us that she already had a number of sources before she even went to Burns Lake. Leaving aside that her original contact is linked to an extortion attempt and that the original extorter was a First Nations lawyer, if Robinson already had made these contacts, why did she need to put up posters before she arrived in Burns Lake? From the transcript, a few days before traveling to Burns Lake, Ms. Robinson drafted a poster announcing she was investigating allegations of abuse at the school in question and wanted to interview any persons who had attended the school and were taught by Mr. Furlong. The poster was to be placed in the Babine Lake Band office and the post office in Burns Lake. Robinson did not contest that she put up these posters, and beyond that, the court wasn't just told there was a poster, they have the exact text of what the poster said. Did you attend Immaculata School or Prince George College? A journalist who is investigating abuse at both schools will be at the Burns Lake Band office on Saturday, April 21st, from noon until 6 p.m. Lunch provided. Please come and tell your story in confidence or leave your contact info and she will contact you. She is interested in students who attended between 1969 and 1976 who had John Furlong as a phys ed teacher or had relatives who had him. He was a tall man from Ireland and a frontier apostle. So, how did that event go? Who showed up?
And to summarize, investigations take a long time, and you accumulate new bits and new testimonials. What ultimately were the allegations against Furlong that you were able to report?
Well, I got up to the Burns Lake Band office. There were 36 people waiting for me. And this is, the notice went out like in a day, and there was a day and a half.
In reality, approximately 35 individuals gathered at the band office on April 21st, 2012. Ms. Robinson's train was an hour late, which gave those assembled the opportunity to discuss the subject of the meeting as a group. As none of the group testified at the trial, it's impossible to know what information was shared by the group during that hour. Ms. Robinson testified that when she arrived, she met with each of those in attendance separately. Most of them had nothing to offer about Mr. Furlong. Rather, they wanted to speak generally about their experiences as First Nations children in a school system that in many cases brutalized and traumatized them. Now, that may seem subtle, but it's really important. In her interview with Jesse Brown, she says that half of them were there as support persons. And in reality, most of them had nothing to offer about Mr. Furlong. They were not there as support people. They showed up because they had a beef with Canada as people subjected to residential schools. So this is something that the population that showed up, the First Nations people making these complaints, primarily had as their concern the historic abuse of residential schools, not the abuse of Mr. Furlong. So I'm just going to pause for a moment to tell you that now this verdict came out, right? The decision and all the factual information available in it, September 2015. On November 2015, Jesse Brown's Canadaland site published an article, I Remember John Furlong. In this article, he is helping the First Nations people who wish to have an investigation into John Furlong continued beyond what he's already had to endure, and he is promoting that effort on his site. This is what the First Nations people have claimed in a letter to the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. It's time that our voices are heard. We, the undersigned, call upon the Prime Minister to request that John Furlong step down from share the podium until we are heard. In her September 2015 judgment, the judge made comments about us without hearing from us. No one had time to listen to us. They should have talked to us before any decision was made. The judge said Laura Robinson distributed a flyer, but we saw no flyer. We communicate not in writing, but by mouth. When we heard Laura was coming to Burns Lake, most people assumed it was to talk about residential schools. Laura talked to those people, and after they left, she talked to us. Those of us who had Mr. Furlong as their PE teacher, many of us, members of the Lake Babine Nations, were not at the Burns Lake band office. Now, first of all, I want to say that this claim that they communicate not in writing but by mouth kind of gets in the way of the fact that they had their statements written down and they initialed it, and then they gave, affidavits, and this is all done in writing. And second of all, they claim that they are members of the Lake Babine Nations. It was in the band office for the Babine community that one of these posters was put up, and whether or not they saw it or whether or not they were told about it doesn't really make a difference. Now, back to the trial. In her interview with Jesse Brown, Laura Robinson says the following.
I'm not going to comment on the sexual abuse because I didn't put it in my article in the first place, but people certainly have given me statements about it.
In reality, as the courts discovered, the sexual abuse allegations were in her first draft. The Toronto Star, who didn't run it, edited them out, and the Georgia Straight agreed with their edit. Robinson made sure the sexual abuse allegations got published anyway. The second of the two articles, published on September 27, 2012, under Ms. Robinson's byline in the Anishinaabe News, John Furlong's Fame Causes Nasty Flashbacks, cites verbatim parts of Ms. Robinson's article that were contained in the Georgia Straight article, but also includes passages from her original unedited version that she had provided to the Straight and others. An example is the following. One student called Anne from Babine Lake First Nation had Furlong as a phys ed teacher and school disciplinarian when she was 11 and 12. On July 12, 2012, she went to the Burns Lake Rcmp detachment and alleged that Furlong had sexually abused her. She said earlier in an affidavit, "He worked us to the bone. His attitude was very bad. You good-for-nothing Indians, come on, come on. If you don't do this, you're going to be good for nothing." She then emailed approximately 180 people, including many news reporters, with the links to her two articles. The secondary one was published intentionally after the Georgia Straight to not scoop them. And one of the individuals who received Ms. Robinson's email was Bob Mackin, a Vancouver reporter. He emailed Ms. Robinson at 8 a.m. on September 27th to say he couldn't find the story about the sexual abuse allegation on the Anishinaabe News website. She explained that the Anishinaabe News article was being held until 11 Pacific time to coordinate with the release of the Georgia Straight article. That afternoon, Ms. Robinson emailed Mr. Switzer, that's the publisher of the secondary article, to say, "Hope you get 1 million hits with the newspaper this month. Thank you so much." On the evening of September 27, 2012, Ms. Robinson wrote an email to Mr. Switzer giving him credit for the wide publication of the sexual abuse allegation. Quote, because you put the info that the Rcmp are investigating Furlong in, they all know that too. Well done. Next, we get the fun of Laura Robinson's big story about how she treats sources who are vulnerable and have experienced sexual abuse.
One of the examples that this original person who emailed me gave me, that person was not going to, she told me what happened, but she said, I've worked so many years in counseling to get rid of these memories.
Yeah.
Not going to be part of this story. And I completely respected that.
Yeah.
And I didn't need her story. By then, I had a huge amount of people in Burns Lake, and I had booked my flight to Burns Lake.
From the decision, the allegation of sexual abuse, the one individual who had told Ms. Robinson, that she had been sexually abused by Mr. Furlong was Beverly Abraham. She was one of the individuals who swore a statutory declaration. On May 8, 2012, approximately a week after her second trip to Burns Lake, Ms. Robinson emailed Ms. Abraham to inquire after her. She ended her email with the following queries. Let me know also if you and others plan on proceeding with civil action against Furlong. Since there is no statute of limitations on sexual abuse, will you move forward on criminal charges? Ms. Abraham responded that she had thought a lot about it and was ready and willing. However, Ms. Robinson heard nothing further for several weeks. This was a concern to Ms. Robinson because she was hoping to publish the story on Mr. Furlong to coincide with the 2012 Summer Olympics in London, England, which were to commence the third week of July on July 5th, 2012. Ms. Robinson again emailed Ms. Abraham to say in part the following. I'm going to report on the physical and emotional abuse, and if you have or are going to go to the police about the sexual abuse, I will certainly report on that. As you know, there's no statute of limitations on sexual abuse, so this really is a criminal matter. I was wondering how you were going to proceed with this. Is it possible for me to either say, by July 25th, when I hope it will be published, quote, Beverly Abraham has contacted the Rcmp about the sexual abuse she alleges John Furlong committed when she was between the ages of 11 and 12? That's not feeding information, is it? All right. Do I have your right age? It appears he came to the school in spring of 1969, went to Prince George in 1970. I don't know if he came back. If you went to kindergarten at age 5 in 1963, you would have been 11 in the spring of 1969, 12 in 1970. I don't know if I have the correct dates, though. Well, certainly she's hoping that Abraham will get the correct dates. If you have contacted the Rcmp, could you give me the name of the investigating officer? I am also interested in knowing if there were other girls who may have been sexually abused who are still alive. If they have committed suicide, could you give me their names? I would contact their families before I would write about them. Despite Laura Robinson's claims on the Canadaland podcast that she didn't need to get testimony from anybody who was a vulnerable person.
Yeah.
And I didn't need her story. By then, I had a huge amount of people in Burns Lake, and I had booked my flight to Burns Lake.
Ms. Robinson was asked in cross-examination why, if Ms. Abraham had said she would go to the Rcmp when she was ready, Ms. Robinson did not simply wait until Ms. Abraham decided she was ready. Ms. Robinson's response was as follows. Well, I hadn't contacted her. This is July 5th, and the other one is from May. The other email is May 8th. So that's 2 months, and I'm going to definitely, the registry is wanting to run the article at the end of July, and either I'm going to write it with the fact that the first draft anyway, I'm going to write it with the fact that she has gone to the Rcmp, or I'm not going to write that allegation at all. And I need to know it's July 5th, and if you work back from when I was leaving for the Olympics, I was leaving on July 17th. I had to get this entire story. I was hoping to get this entire story finished. Get ready to go to the Olympics. So this is just either I'm going to include, either she's going to go, or I'm not going to put it in. Those are my two options. So here's Laura Robinson telling Jesse Brown she never would have published an article like his Ghomeshi one unless the witnesses, the sources, had gone on the record. Well, wasn't really the case with the Ghomeshi story.
And so they were going on the record with their names.
Oh, absolutely on the record with their names.
Huh.
Yeah.
Was there any question of if had you only been able to get anonymous sources, was the story a non-starter?
Oh, it would have been a non-starter. There's no way you could ever write about someone like John Furlong with anonymous names. No, I wouldn't have done it.
Uh-oh, Jesse Brown's starting to sweat.
Uh-huh.
And even with 4 people, I wouldn't have done it.
Oh my, 4 people. That's the number of anonymous sources Jesse Brown had in his Ghomeshi case. And Laura Robinson's case is falling apart dramatically right now.
A lot of people would say, I'll thump ya, that he would say, I'll thump ya, I'll thump ya. And then one person, Beverly Abraham, alleged sexual abuse.
All right, so now it's time to talk about the specific civil cases, civil suits brought against John Furlong by his accusers. Beverly Abraham was the only one who made sexual abuse accusations on the record at the beginning. And she and another woman, something West, and a dude is like, he ended up with 3 civil charges against him. And I'm going to explain to you why they were dropped. Because they make it sound like, oh, well, they lost interest, and so it doesn't mean he's innocent. They were just dropped. No, there's very good reason why they were dropped. So the Rcmp investigation into the Beverly Abraham complaint. This was handled mostly by Corporal Mackey, who went and testified in the trial, which is really useful for our purposes. Corporal Mackey interviewed Ms. Abraham several times. He also interviewed Ms. Abraham's mother using an interpreter because she spoke only Carrier, and a brother and sister of Ms. Abraham. In addition, he interviewed many of the persons Ms. Abraham told him would corroborate her information, although some of them he could not locate. Corporal Mackey's evidence was that the persons he interviewed did not give him the corroborating information Ms. Abraham indicated they would provide. He was also of the view that her description of the events contained many troubling inconsistencies. Among other information, names and dates changed with each interview.
So eventually they ended up calling me when I was covering the London Olympics, and by then they were investigating. So of course I had nothing to do with the allegations made.
Corporal Mackey received a telephone message from Ms. Robinson on July 15, 2012, and spoke with her in person on July 16th. According to the notes he took during the conversation, Ms. Robinson told him she believed Mr. Furlong had attempted to cover up his past in Burns Lake and Prince George. Ms. Robinson said she had concerns about both Immaculata Elementary School and Prince George College, where Mr. Furlong had taught. Ms. Robinson told him about the affidavits she'd gathered, but thought the Rcmp would be getting a court order to have her release them. Corporal Mackey suggested it would be easier if she just gave him the names of the individuals who'd sworn affidavits. Ms. Robinson did give him the name of 4 of the individuals, but told Corporal Mackey that, while she wanted to help, she didn't want to appear to be working with the police. Corporal Mackey told Ms. Robinson that Ms. Abraham's statement that she gave to Ms. Robinson was inconsistent with the statements she gave police. That's fairly important. Ms. Robinson did not seem to care about that. Ms. Robinson told Corporal Mackey that Ms. Abraham was very clear, consistent, and concise when she gave her statements to Ms. Robinson. Corporal Mackey advised Ms. Robinson that Ms. Abraham had been nothing like that when she gave her statements to the Rcmp, perhaps because Ms. Robinson was not there to assist her. He said the statement she first gave to the Rcmp was inconsistent with each of the later statements she gave. All right, so the civil suits filed against Mr. Furlong. In 2013, 3 civil suits were filed against Mr. Furlong and the diocese responsible for Immaculata Elementary School. All were filed by persons from whom Ms. Robinson had taken statements in the course of her investigation: Gracie Jessie West, Daniel Maurice, and, as already noted, Ms. Abraham. Ms. West filed her claim in July 2013. She alleged Mr. Furlong was her physical education teacher at Immaculata Elementary School in the school year 1969 to 1970, and that he physically and sexually abused her. All right, so why was the case dropped? Mr. Furlong brought an application to dismiss the claim on the basis that Ms. West did not attend Immaculata in 1969 or 1970, and he was successful in his application. West versus Furlong. She gives a summary of that case, but essentially, Gracie Jessie West did not even attend the school at which she is claiming she was abused by Mr. Furlong at the time. And after her case was dismissed, Ms. Abraham decided to drop her case and go no further. Now, the lawyer for all three of these applicants, Mr. Grattle, started dropping them like flies. Right now, at the moment in this storytelling, we have one left, and that is Mr. Maurice. Now, the reason Mr. Maurice didn't successfully sue Furlong was primarily because he'd already claimed that he'd been abused at another school. So there is some evidence that Laura Robinson's presented that Maurice was actually in attendance at Immaculata, but unfortunately for him, in the eyes of the law, when you've claimed to have been abused at another school during the same time frame, your credibility is shot if you then claim to be abused in a different school.
Okay, the Toronto Star. Why did the Toronto Star not?
You're going to have to ask the Toronto Star exactly why they killed the story.
Who made that decision?
That was made above Colin McKenzie. He was the national news editor at the time. Colin felt terrible about it. He's no longer there.
Well, since Jessie Brown wanted to end on the note of the Toronto Star, so will I. I'm going to end with the opinion of John Miller. Ms. Robinson tendered the expert opinion of John Miller, the Miller Report, who also testified at trial. Mr. Miller was qualified as an expert in the field of journalism generally, and more specifically on professional standards of investigative journalism. He was senior executive newsroom editor for 13 years at the Toronto Star. Toronto Star happens to be the paper that published the Ghomeshi story, incidentally, including 5 years as senior deputy managing editor in charge of news and feature coverage. Mr. Miller taught reporting and newsroom leadership for 23 years at Ryerson University School of Journalism. Here's the problem with John Miller's evidence. Counsel for Mr. Furlong objected to many passages in the Miller Report on the basis that they contained inflammatory allegations founded solely on hearsay, which Mr. Miller had accepted as true for the purposes of his opinion. Oh, gosh, that just doesn't sound good for investigative reporters. Other passages were objectionable because they were advocacy and argument and amounted to partisan attack on Mr. Furlong. I, the judge, ruled that those objections were well-founded and redacted significant portions of the Miller Report before it was marked as an exhibit at trial. So that says something about what investigative journalism has to offer in terms of actual fact. Yeah, most of it should be redacted. Right, so the Miller Report advanced a definition of investigative journalism found in Story-Based Inquiry, a manual for investigative journalists. The judge and I quoted that at the beginning of her judgment and my video. It was authored by Mark Lee Hunter and published by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. Investigative journalism involves exposing to the public matters that are concealed either deliberately by someone in a position of power or accidentally behind a chaotic mass of facts and circumstances that obscure understanding. Mr. Miller acknowledged that he was not familiar with the manual itself, this thing that he's, bringing up and quoting from. He took the definition from the UNESCO website, but had not actually read the manual. I don't know. What do you say about that? Let's move on to the next problem. Mr. Miller offered the opinion that Ms. Robinson began her investigation of Mr. Furlong with a tip that he was not all he said he was, and worked with that hypothesis during the following months as she investigated his past. He testified that being guided in that manner by a hypothesis was accepted journalistic practice. In cross-examination, it was put to Mr. Miller that if an investigative journalist begins with a working hypothesis, he or she should first try to disprove it, otherwise the journalist may succumb to confirmation bias. Mr. Miller was not familiar with the concept of confirmation bias. Don't even finish that sentence. He claims to not even understand what confirmation bias means. Oh my. So that reflects rather poorly on the Toronto Star, who happened to be the host for Jessie Brown's story about Ghomeshi, and decided it was a good idea to go to Laura Robinson's trial without actually reading the sources of the things they were bringing there as an expert. So keep that in mind. Jesse Brown's Canadaland purports to be the watchdog of the media, but he's hiding behind the same media that doesn't understand ethics, and Jesse Brown's even worse. He doesn't think fact-checking is all that important because he thinks you and I will do it for him. Well, that's what we have to start doing. I think it's time for the public to demand full accountability from journalists and demand the information to allow us to fact-check what is supposedly the news.
But the problems that come with an editor, I mean, like the truth is that there's no better fact checker, no better copy editor than the public. Unfortunately, you have to publish first to get their input often.